Well, let's see now. The video's done, the photography's done, the pictures are up on Facebook, and the video is live on YouTube. Well, guess all that remains now is to box it up and send it off to the customer. That's a real pity. Too bad, because I really did like this one. I should have built one just like it. I mean, identical to this one, with maybe one or two small differences to it. Oh, wait! That's right. I did. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale M60A1 main battle tank. The model that we have here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I frequently mention in these build videos, I often take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. And at this point here, I wouldn't be surprised if I have a large number of my subscribers and frequent viewers who are angrily wagging their finger at the computer screen saying, "Aha! I caught you, John! You're trying to pass off a model that you made a video on a little while ago and trying to pass it off to all of us as a new build. This is ridiculous. You must be running out of content." Well, first I want to say thank you for being a subscriber to the channel and also for watching my content to know that I've made a video of a vehicle that looked very similar to this one. And no, I am not running out of content. Quite the contrary, I'm actually drowning in videos that are desperately desiring to be edited. This model here looks very similar to a model that I recently completed because both of these models were built at the same time to basically identical specs. If we can recall from that other video, that model started off as a Tamiya re-release of a vintage 1970s era Tamiya M60A1 main battle tank kit. That model was built for private commission and belongs to a private collector and was built and re-detailed to the configuration that you see in that video. Well, during the time I was working on that build, I decided to grab one of my own personal kits that were in my stash and build it up at the same time to basically the exact same specs as the one in the other video. This model, however, started off as a vintage Tamiya M60A1 kit from the 1970s time frame. So this one here is the real McCoy as opposed to the other one, which is a re-release. Also, unlike that model, this one here did receive a few other extra add-ons that were not made to the other model in the other video, and we'll be going over all these extra modifications and details that went into this build here, as well as review the original base starter kit. So stay tuned because there's going to be a whole heap load of content coming right at you. So to start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the venerable M60A1 main battle tank. Now I'm going to attempt to keep this as short as possible because I've already done several other model showcase videos of this particular tank family, and basically all the other specs and the litany of the background for this vehicle are discussed in more depth in those videos. However, in a nutshell, the M60A1 was the mainstay of the U.S. Armored Corps from the late 1960s until the mid-1980s. At that point there, the vehicle was basically regarded as secondary purpose in the U.S. Army when the M1 Abrams came out and entered into full production. The vehicles were still utilized by the U.S. Marine Corps up until the vehicle's retirement in the mid-1990s, when the U.S. Army also phased out this tank family during this period as well. The design of this tank is heavily influenced and built upon lessons learned from the M48 Patton tank family, which preceded it. On the M60, such design cues that were carried over was the composition of the all-in-one cast bathtub hull, as well as the single-piece cast turret. Other components that were directly carried over were components like the suspension. Both the torsion bar suspension as well as the tracks and the remainder of the running gear are basically identical in design and in spec to the ones found on the 48. The biggest difference between the two designs was the engine. The M60 from the get-go was intended to be powered by the Continental diesel engine. Of course, the 48 would also be equipped with this engine, but this was a later change because the vehicles were originally designed to have a gas engine. In addition to the 60 being designed from the ground up to have this new diesel engine, the M60 was designed from day one to utilize the NATO standard 105mm tank gun. Aside from the main armament, the vehicle was also the first main battle tank in the US military to replace the M2HB and the Browning 1919 derived coaxial machine gun with the new M87 and M73. Although that's probably a decision that they would later regret. Regardless, this vehicle was built from the ground up to utilize all of these new weapon systems. The vehicle had a crew of 4, and another improvement from the 48 was with the interior space. The M60 was a more roomier tank to be serving inside compared to the relatively cramped conditions found on the M48 family. This vehicle, once adopted, went into full production, and a large number of them were built. Not only were they utilized by the US military, but this vehicle was widely exported to many allied countries of the US, where most of those vehicles that were widely exported are still in service with these same countries even till today. Also, although while the M60 main battle tank platform itself has been retired by the US military for a number of decades now, there are still 2 variants that are hangovers that are still in service, be it in a diminished form, and are more likely going to be on their way out within the next couple years. One, of course, is the bridge layer variant, and the other is the engineering vehicle. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. We'll also go ahead and walk you through the other modifications and additions that were made to the model in order to bring it up to the condition that we see it here. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage Tamiya 1/35 scale M60A1 main battle tank. And when I say vintage, I mean it, specifically in this case. To give you an idea when Tamiya developed this model, at the time, the M60A1 was still being referred to by the US military as a medium tank. The Tamiya M60A1. This is probably one of my favorite kits that were released by Tamiya from this era, and this kit is actually a hallmark kit. This model is another one of those kits that really have been able to stand the test of time and is still with us today, albeit in a upgraded format, but the DNA still traces back directly to this particular kit release here. And you'll be able to see that once I go ahead and crack the box open. Before this, when it came for plastic armor model kits, all of the plastic model companies, both American and Japanese, had a smattering of different subjects and different subject matters throughout a wide range of weird, wacky scales, from 130 to 148 to 150. And they would release a bunch of kits in a range and then develop a new scale and come up with another range of kits. But Tamiya decided to stick with one scale, and one scale only, primarily for their military miniatures line. During the mid-1960s, Tamiya went ahead and had their engineers develop a plastic model kit scale where they could fit 2 C batteries on the inside of a plastic model tank hull, along with enough room to fit in a gearbox. When they came up with a model that had this sufficient size, the engineers went ahead and did some math and calibrated the scale to 135, and thus the 135th scale genre was born. The first kit, or I should say one of the first kits to take advantage of this, was their Panther Alpha A. And the following year, in 1970, Tamiya started further releasing and developing new kits in this brand new, at the time, scale. This M60A1 was one of them. Now, just like with all the other 135th scale kits that are being developed, they were all designed to be motorized, and this kit here is no exception. This model from the ground up was intended to either be single or dual motor gearbox powered, and Tamiya offered both of these variants in 2 different configurations. Now, I recently completed a model showcase video on a Tamiya re-release of the Vintage line, where it has the old box art that would have been found on the dual motor unit, and in there I go over in more depth the difference between the 2 variants. In a nutshell, the one with the fancier box art would have received the dual motor gearbox, while the version with the white background would have originally had a single motor gearbox. Tamiya would have produced these kits at the same time throughout the early 1970s timeframe. However, from the mid-70s and onward, the dual motor system would be dropped, and Tamiya would only focus on releasing this kit here either as a static plastic model kit or with the single motor gearbox. This continued up until the 1980s, and by this point here, Tamiya totally pulled out of the motorization game and exclusively just sold their kits in a static format. This kit would stay in production for a good period of time, and a large number of these kits were produced. By the late 1980s, Tamiya decided to go ahead and revisit the M60, taking this kit and further enhancing it, giving it better detailing compared to the original 1970 offering. This version would be upgraded again in the early 1990s, and that would result with the current US Marine Corps kit of the M60A1, which has been sold by Tamiya really ever since. Also by the 1990s, Academy decided to make their own rendition of the M60A1, where they took the Tamiya kit, added some other modifications and alterations to it, and then releasing it as their own. That kit is still in wide production today, and Academy has expanded that kit into several other different variants, from the Israeli variants of the Magach to even their very recent release of their M60A2 Starship. But all of these kits I just mentioned have their lineage back to this guy right over here. Now, this model here is one of the kits which were imported into the United States in the mid to late 1980s time frame. This model here, the reason why I say that is because it has the MRC logo mounted right here in the corner. MRC is an importer for plastic model kits, and they used to be, I believe they might still be located out in Edison, New Jersey. At that time, they were the sole exclusive importer for the Tamiya kits in the US. Eventually, this would end when Tamiya USA would open up business in the California area. Now, MRC is still in business today. Oddly enough, they are the importers of the Academy kits, and many of those are those M60 kits that I just mentioned. Now, this particular kit here I purchased off of eBay back in 2009. Around that time, these kits were all over eBay and were being sold for really affordable prices. This kit here I acquired for about 20 to about 25 US dollars, and it wasn't the only one. At the time, I was just snagging as many of these kits as I could get a hold of, because at the time, I really wanted to build these models in very different paint configurations, and these just make for really fun builds overall. Now, as for this particular kit, again, it's been sitting in the stash ever since 2009, and you can see from the layer of gunk on the box, it's definitely about time I get to it. Starting with the model's graphic design, this is your typical Tamiya white background box art where the vehicle is in the foreground and there's really nothing else going on. It's just focusing on the base vehicle at hand. The box art quality itself is standard for Tamiya. It's a little bit rougher compared to what you see on more later Tamiya box arts, but having said that, the artwork is still nicely rendered. You can see all the detailing painted here on the suspension, as well as the remainder of the tank. Now, on the motorized unit, you would have the exact same type of layout with the exact same type of fonts and typeface, but the difference is that over here in the fine verbiage, you would have the phrase "It's motorized" in all caps with an exclamation point. Now, also it's interesting to point out that in the mid-1980s, MRC went with this really long box format for these kits. Now, the earlier versions of this kit release had a slightly shorter overall length with the box, and MRC went ahead and adjusted it in order so they could fit their little logo in this corner over here. From the MRC logo, here we have some other little factoids about the vehicle's overall size and dimensions. A nice little paragraph over here in order to give you, I guess, a little bit of motivation. Here we have the logo. Note the MRC information is directly below it. They politely remind you that paint and glue are not included. And at least they're honest, they tell you that the box art is considerably larger than the actual kit contents themselves. The remainder of the graphic design starts with the sides. Here we have, again, the same illustration with that same bulbous M60 font that Tamiya love to use on these kits. On this portion here, again, same illustration. We have here a little profile view. Some of the specs. It's molded in Japan, which would definitely change on later kits released by Tamiya. Packaged in the US, and they remind you again that you're on your own with the building supplies. Here we have the corporate information. Note that MRC is located in Edison, New Jersey, and like I said before, this would change when Tamiya America would be established. Here we have a little segment on the brief history of the model. Now this is written in English, and I believe it's the exact same information on the earlier kits, but this section here would have been written in Japanese. And on the opposite side, here we have a slew of other kit offerings, which was standard for Tamiya to do of the period. But what was always a real cock tease was that they would show the snippets of the box arts, but these weren't the ones that were in production anymore. These were just, all the kits were still in production, but they weren't the ones with these killer box arts. They were just the plain Jane white background version. But like I said before, these box arts were always extremely gorgeous. Here we have the M42 Duster. M41 Walker Bulldog. Probably my favorite box art of all time. The original Tamiya M4 A3E8 Sherman with the tiger face. Absolutely love that box art. T3485. Now this box art here was originally used on their 1/25th scale rendition, but Tamiya went ahead and, to their credit, recycled it for use on their 1/35th scale counterpart. And the SU100, which again, this kit I believe was also the box art again for the 1/25th scale rendition. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and crack this model open to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. Well, first we have a pile of vintage bags over here. Keep in mind this kit was purchased off of eBay in a used state. Digging into the box takes us to the first runner, which is of the turret. Now, the turret itself is very similar to the versions found on the M60A1 kits from Tamiya that we're used to today. The only difference is with the old kit here, the mantlet did not have its canvas tarpaulin molded in, and instead the mantlet was able to go up and down. This is not just true for the main gun, but also for the mini turret cupola section that we have here. The gypsy rack is also supplied, but it's in a slightly different form to the way we're used to these pieces being rendered today. Also not included is that little square piece of mesh work, which the kit supplies you in order to achieve this level of detailing. So that was absent on these older kits. The kit is molded in this really dark olive drab plastic, which was quite customary for Tamiya kits of this period, and would be seen on other kits like their M43E8, the M41, the Duster, and also their Sheridan kit. Now these kits were all manufactured in Japan, and that is identified by this little banner that we have here on this tab. Now on the new re-release kit, the moldings are done in the Philippines, but even though it's done with the same molds, Tamiya goes ahead and they mill out the information found in this little section over here about where the kit was molded. Digging down deeper takes us to the runner that contains the suspension components. Now note the sprockets on this kit here are very different compared to what we're used to seeing today on these Tamiya kits. Although oddly enough, these exact sprockets here are supplied with the current generation Tamiya kits. It's just an appendix from this old original 1970s tooling. Note the kit was originally designed to be motorized, like I said, and you can see that with that little slot for the adjustable gearbox, as well as the little hex section molded into the rear portion of the sprocket, so the sprocket can lock onto the gearbox. The rest of the kit still assembles the exact same way as today, where you have these two side panels which glue onto the round bathtub hull that I'll go ahead and talk about in a second. Here we have the row wheels. Now on this kit here, it has the aluminum pattern of row wheel. This would change on later renditions of the M60 re-release from Tamiya, where they render it with the stamped steel pattern wheel. Here we have the upper and lower hull. Note the gearbox tracks. as well as the motor, or I should say the battery box locations. And this would stay basically the same even up till today. Here's the lower hull. Note, made in Japan, molded in the upper section here. These kits feature functional hatches on all of their sections, including the bow and on the turret. When the kit was later redesigned, only the bow hatch remained to be functional, while the two in the turret were static only. Now basically, these two sections here have remained basically the same and unaltered since the 1970 release. If anyone has ever worked on one of these Tamiya M60s before, this here should seem extremely familiar to you. The detailing on this section here is actually pretty well done, which basically is why Tamiya hasn't really changed it. On the lower hull, some people wish that they would make the upgrade of deleting these gigantic holes that are found on the bottom. It gives you that little face look that we have. This little slot here would have originally been for the switch, so you could go either the middle was off, left was forward, and right was reverse, or vice versa. This hole here was for the adjustment of the gearbox. And this hole here, I believe, was for the wire for the two-way wire remote to exit from the rear of the vehicle. The original ones would have had made in Japan molded into the bottom section here. This would later, of course, be removed like I mentioned before. But other than that, the tooling itself, again, basically the same. Digging down deeper takes us to the track. Now, the tracks are definitely something that are going to show their age on these old kits. They are I should say they're supposed to represent the rubber chevron variant of the tracks, but they are considerably basic compared to what we're used to today. Tamiya themselves would also retool these on their later renditions of the kit, where it has the octagonal pattern, and they are much higher in detail fidelity compared to these older ones. On the phase detailing, it's basically there. You get the idea. It's the double chevron view. On the inside here, you can see that it's much simpler compared to what we're used to today. Note, it's missing the skeletal structure found on these two sections that are on the outer portions of the rubber inner pad. The teeth are there. They're rendered on the smaller side, but are, again, nicely molded. The only problem with the teeth, like I mentioned in the other video, is that they are not in their correct locations. The teeth on the M60 pattern of track, and this is also true for the Pershing and the M48s, as well as the Sherman for that matter, would have been on the little line here in the center hinge where the two track links actually articulate. For some reason, they molded it here in the center of the pad, and this is something that is seen on a few of the other Tamiya kits of the period, and are also still found in some of their kits even today, like their M5 Stewarts, the M3 Lee, the M3 Grant, and those are just a couple to name a few off the top of my head. But again, it should be totally suffice for this build here. Now, of course, you could change these out, but again, I'll go over that as the build progresses. Digging down deeper, here we have the water slide decal sheet. You have two options in order to build this vehicle, either with the Yellow 12 or with the Griffin. Again, two different type of vehicles, but these decals should hold up pretty well, and I've had some pretty decent results with them in the past. Even though these decal sheets are as old as they are, probably the same age as me, I've had some pretty good luck in the past when it comes to working with these decals. From the decal sheet now brings us to stuff that's very, very dated and vintage. Here we have a nice little brochure of a mini Tamiya catalog. And nothing screams Tamiya from the 1980s more than this type of a pamphlet. Crack it open and there it is. Soak it all in. 1980s advertising goodness. Interestingly enough, I've actually built just about all of the kits found on this little section over here at one time or another. And for anyone who's a fan of the channel, you should recognize this Japanese Type 74 because I've actually built this exact kit. Well, not the one in the picture, but the one that they're advertising here, and a video of that can be found on the ECA YouTube channel. Not to mention, pictures are on the Facebook page. At the time, there were really two 1/16 scale kits still being made. We had the King Tiger with the Hanschel turret and the Gepard. And yes, by this time the Sherman was no longer in production, which was a bane for collectors and people who are trying to get into the 1/16 scale market. And at the time, Shermans, I'm not going to lie, were rarer than hen's teeth. If you could find a Tamiya 1/16 scale M4 Sherman, you were one of the cool kids. And by the way, these kits here utilize the clutch system. In fact, I actually have a video, come to think of it, of this kit here, again, on the ECA channel, where I go over the clutch system and how the model looks and drives. Basically, this guy here is the ancestor to the current generation of the King Tiger kit that is, or was made by Tamiya for a number of years. On the back, some cool sports cars and such, but not really the scope of this video series. Digging down deeper, we have here a little pamphlet to mail into MRC to get a Tamiya catalog. Would be kind of funny to actually fill this out and see if it if anything comes from it. But probably not. I'm cheap. I don't want to pay. But yeah, that's actually pretty funny. Here we have a nice little cross section here of the Tamiya color palette. These colors are, again, I guess still in production today. And that takes us to the instruction manual. This is typical for Tamiya kits of the period, where we have a nice little brief history of the model, and they're actually pretty thorough. We have some pretty cool sketches of the vehicles that they're mentioning. We have a nice picture here of a real M60A1 with an AAV7, which Tamiya also went ahead and released in 1/35 scale as well. That cool little American tanker caricature to tell you to read the instructions before you build it. And here goes the instructions. You have a lot of snippets of the test piece, which was actually in the Tamiya catalog. And this instruction here is basically typical for what one would expect of a Tamiya kit of the period. Tamiya kit instructions have always been really, really good, and this one here is no exception. And now this leads us to the coolest thing and the most strangest inclusion on this kit for very last. And that has to do with this little bit of equipment that we have here. What is this, you may ask? Well, if you saw the other video I made, you'll know because I alluded to it. But if you didn't, if you look at the Tamiya M60 turret, you'll notice that there's no locations molded in order to affix the grab rails. Instead, we have these small little indentations molded on the surface. What these indentations are, well, they're locations for you to drill out. But you're not going to drill them out on this model because at the time, I guess nobody had a Dremel, and for some reason they didn't think about telling you to use a pin vise. Instead, they wanted you to use something that basically everybody had in their household: a stove. How do you drill those out with a stove? Well, quite simply, with this. Tamiya gave these models here this bit of equipment, which was nothing more than a literal sharp, pointy metal stick that was made from copper. Note the point on the end. And the way this worked is that when it came time to drilling out the little holes for the grab handles, you would take this guy, heat him up on the stove or a candle, and then literally just melt the holes in the indication that they want you to. Keep in mind, this is something that I doubt very much would be accepted today. And specifically keep in mind that these kits here were by and large meant for kids to build. So they literally, not only did they want you to play with matches, but they also gave you a little shiv in your Tamiya Model Tank kit. And even had a little scabbard too, of all things. So, but keep in mind, when this kit was developed was 1970, and literally at the time you had the Manson family running around. Not saying the two are exclusive, but it was definitely another era to be said. I mean, it's even oxidized. You could probably get some tetanus. Yeah. In addition to this little keychain size shiv, the kit also came with this really gnarly looking broken screwdriver. It's not, obviously this is not part of the kit. This is just something that came with the model and is generally something that you find occasionally when you purchase used models off of eBay. Starting with the lower hull and the suspension components, all the components that you see here are the kit supply parts and were utilized out of the box. One difference between the early pattern Tamiya kit compared to the later re-releases is that the lower hull on this version here is a lot more simplistic in its detailing compared to its redesigned counterparts. When the kit was redesigned, Tamiya added a few more other accessories such as hooks that will be found on the lower section here of the hull, and these are found on later incarnations of the M60. For this earlier pattern here, these details would not necessarily be found and are omitted on the stock Tamiya kit. Because of this does simplify the build compared to its later incarnations. One other thing I want to point out though, and this is true for not just the M60 but also their M48 kits as well, is with the way the hull is shaped, you will have this secondary piece that gets glued to the bottom portion, and because of this type of assembly, a seam line will be present. The seam lines can hurt the look of the model and are easily addressed with some basic bodywork. A little bit of putty and some sandpaper and possibly some thick super glue should be enough to polish away the seam work, leaving for the appearance that we have here. This greatly improves the look of the model compared to having it with its seam line present. With this type of a kit here, this gives you, or I should say a beginner, someone to really practice their skills on when it comes to mastering such things as seam removal. I also want to point out that this type of a hull assembly is not just found on the Tamiya pattern of M60 and M48 models, but is also found on several other more modern tooled up kits that have been recently released. Such kits come to mind like the Dragon M48 and M60 series, as well as the Revell Germany M48 series kits as well. Where I deviated from the kit is with the front axle. With the way the kit is designed, you have two plastic pegs that get inserted on the two front sections here, and this is the axle point for the front idler wheel. Normally this is perfectly fine and works well for static display, but since this model is motorized, it's best to have it with a solid metal axle just for added strength and functionality. Adding this axle is not a very difficult feature because the kit was originally designed, of course, to be motorized and to have a solid metal axle mounted in this section here. No mods were needed to have been made to the kit. Only thing I did was just not mount on the stock supplied plastic bits and just replace them with a metal rod. For the metal rod, an 1/8 of an inch metal rod is what's going to be required if you want to go this route on your own build. And for this rod here, this was actually lifted, or I should say borrowed, from the other M60 kit that I built for the customer. That kit, if we can recall, utilizes two steel rods in order to mount on the sprocket as well as the front idler wheel. Well, because that model is built motorized as well, I had an extra axle rod in my supply, so I might as well use it for the purposes of this build. The piece just dropped directly in place and no other mods were needed to be made in order for the idlers to mount to the vehicle. Moving towards the rear, the model takes us to the rear sprocket, and this is a bit of detailing where I deviated from the stock kit. As we can recall from the last vintage M60 that I built, the kit, when originally tooled up in 1970, utilizes a very simplistic, stylized sprocket for the vehicle. The sprocket that we have here is not the kit one, and instead I swapped it out for a second generation Tamiya pattern sprocket. This particular sprocket is a spare from my Academy M60A1 Rise with the M9 dozer blade build that I too built a little while ago, and there's also a video of that build on the channel. If anyone has seen that video, you'll note that with the way the Academy kit is designed, you have about 3 patterns of sprocket on hand. One of which is a appendix carryover of the first pattern sprocket that, oddly enough, this kit originally has. The other 2 are the redesigned sprocket, which stems back from the Tamiya kits that came out in the 1980s. When Tamiya redesigned and retooled their M60 kit, one of the first additions or revisions that they made was they tooled up a better pattern of sprocket which better replicates the sprocket found on the M60 family. If you look at the sprocket here, you'll see that the tooth ring has this little indent section with the fasteners. The inside does have some center hub detailing. The profile of the teeth are more prototypical compared to the older stylized version, and we have the tooth rings that we have here on the inside. While on the sprockets, the last bit of detailing I want to point out are the mud slits, which are found on the inner sleeve here of this drum, and there are 3 total. You can see 2 represented right here, and the third one is found right along this section. This is a modification that I frequently make to all of my 1/35 scale M60s because it is an easy way to improve the detailing on the stock kit. This is also true for the more modern kits from Dragon as well. They molded the pieces solid without the mud slits present, and the mud slits are a nice bit of detailing that are found on a majority of the real vehicles. I have to stress majority because there are certain examples of M60 sprockets that were made by one of the subcontractors that did not have the mud slits present. So again, it's one of those features where it's okay to add, but if you want to leave the unit without the mud slits, you're not committing any sort of an inaccuracies. But I want to stress again, the addition of the mud slits really do help the overall look of the model and are one of those features that makes it look like you put a little bit extra effort into your build. Moving our way to the rear of the vehicle takes us to some of the aftermarket additions that have been mounted to this model, namely the lenses for the rear taillights, as well as the mud guards which descend downward from the rear fender work. The rear taillights were one of the details that have always been the weaker points on the M60 family of kits that are offered by Tamiya. When the kit was originally designed in 1970, aka this fellow that we have here, the taillights are in the following format, where we have this tombstone housing, which is a nice feature, but the cat's eye lenses found on the taillights themselves are detailless, faceless, and are just not present. They're just a faceless disc that is found on the piece's moldings. This feature of the detailless taillights are not only found on the M60A1, but they're 1970s release of M60A2 Starship kits as well. What's even more interesting was that when Tamiya took the M60 kit and retooled and redesigned it, improving many aspects of this model, for one reason or another, the taillights were something that they never addressed. This same pattern of taillight that's found on their 1970 kit release is present on their M60A3 revised kit, as well as their final revised version of this family of vehicle, which came out in the 1990s, and that's their US Marine Corps M60A1 with the reactive armor. To further make things interesting, when Academy took the M60 Tamiya kit and made their own copies of it, they made some revisions to the Tamiya tooling, and one of them is, interestingly enough, replacing or revising the mistakes found on the rear cat's eye lenses. The Academy kit, in many respects, is actually a more polished and finely tuned version compared to the original Tamiya tooling that's found on actual Tamiya kits. Back to this fellow here. Luckily, if you do have one of the Tamiya kits and you stumble into finding out that the cat's eyes have no detailing on them, it's nothing to worry about because the aftermarket scene have plenty of improvements for this exact same model. The versions that we have here are a photo etch drop-in component from Edward. The Edward set supplies you with a ton of PE in order to spice your M60 up, taking it from the stock original offering and giving it a lot more detailing. One of the aspects where this is best done or illustrated is with their cat's eye lenses. The cat's eyes that are supplied with the Edward set are actually more complicated than the way you see it here, because not only do they supply you with the cat's eye, but they even have the whole housing as a replacement photo etch piece, which is very interesting, but in my opinion, it's just not necessary in order for you to improve the model up further. All I did was I kept the stock pieces and dropped the cat's eye lenses directly on them. In order to paint them, as you can see, one of the units, namely the one on the left-hand side, has its lens painted in red, while the one on the right-hand side is blacked out, which is what you would expect to see on a U.S. military vehicle from World War II all the way up till present day. Another bit of detailing that is supplied with the Edward set that's absent on the original 1970 tooling M60 kit are the mudguards. One interesting bit of detailing that the M60 family does have is that on the rear fenders there is a blade that comes down and bends around and goes in this portion here next to the taillight. What this guard does, it protects the taillight housing from getting damaged from any sort of dirt or particulate that can and eventually will be kicked up by these tracks. This detailing, of course, is absent on the original 1970 kit because, again, the original kit was designed to be motorized, and something like this would easily cause problems when it came time to removing and remounting of the upper hull. When Tamiya redesigned their M60 family kit in the 1980s, they went ahead and tooled up this section here as a plastic piece and just drops directly in place. And this is one of the reasons why the Edward photo etch set is a great addition to if you're sprucing up one of these vintage 1970 kits, because again, you are missing this piece with the stock model. The Edward piece is again made from photo etch. It's a bit on the complex end in that there's this whole piece on the end section where you get to bend it around to form the shape of the tombstone. But for this model here, I just simply amputated that section off and kept the remainder, which is required for use of the blade. Now you may be wondering to yourself, well, John, Tamiya themselves omitted this piece from their build because the model was motorized. And since your model here is motorized, how did you go about doing it? Well, very simply put, this was something that took a little figuring out in order to accomplish, because you can't just mount this directly to the rear fender because it's just not going to be suitable when it comes time for getting access to the gearbox, which is something you do have to do on a motorized tank. So what I went ahead and did was I actually mounted the metal PE to the hull itself, and it's just touching the fender, but it's not glued to it in any way. If I pop the upper hull off, you can see exactly how the unit breaks down. Like I said before, the photo etch just bends to shape and is permanently attached to the lower sections here, which do not cause any difficulty whatsoever with getting access to the model. And to put the model back together, it just tongue and grooves into this location as originally intended. And once back together again, the look is absolutely seamless. Moving our way back to the front of the model takes to the front lift hooks. These are the kit supply ones and are used predominantly out of the box. The only modification that I made, and it's a common modification that I make on these M60 kits, is I drill out the bottom portion here with a pin vise. The indentations are found on the stock Tamiya kit tooling, and it's a quick run through with a pin vise or a Dremel for that matter, and by doing so it's an easy way to bring up your model's accuracy. From the front toe points takes us momentarily back to the track. I do want to point out that this track here is the stock original track and was utilized out of the box. And this is one of the weaker aspects of the 1970 tooling of Tamiya M60A1 kits. This part here really does show its age. Now for this model here, because it's a motorized model, I left it as is, as it works for this build. But if you are working on one of these kits and are playing around with upgrading the kit's detailing, perhaps this is something you might want to look into replacing. There are some nice workable track links out there for the M60 family from AFV Club, and they have both patterns, both the chevron pattern and the octagonal pattern. Either one would improve this kit from the offering that we have here. This is also something that was changed on the later releases of the Tamiya M60 kit, although they never seem to have made a version with the chevron tracks, as all the other upgraded M60 kits that came out utilize the octagonal pattern link. If you're working on the old Tamiya M60A2 Starship kit, expect to find these tracks in that kit as well. Moving up brings us to the bow headlights. These are the stock units and were simply mounted as is. These units are okay out of the box and no real other mods are needed to be made to them. Just be sure when you're painting them, you paint them in the following formats, where the blackout light is the one found on the right hand side and the standard headlight would be the one found on the left. For the brush guards, these are the kit original units, and the one modification that I made was with this support bracket that we have here on each side. This is a common addition that I make on these older generation kits, and is one that is a easy addition that can be made, and is one that does help the look of the model. The piece is fabricated out of a thin piece of plastic angle from Plastruct. This piece simply gets cut, trimmed to shape, and then mounted to the model. It's again a real easy way to improve the look of your build. From here takes us to some of the other photo etch. On the inside portion here of the tin work, it's probably difficult to get on screen, but here we go. On the photo etch there is the brace bracket which connects the tin work to the front portion here of the hull. This again is supplied and you have to carefully bend the piece to shape, and then once bent it just drops directly in place. Right over here, painted in red, is the tank's bow fire extinguisher handle box. Now this was one change that I made from the stock kit. See, the stock Tamiya kit has this unit molded in as an amorphous lump. It's okay that they give it to you, but it can be improved. The unit that we have here is a resting copy of the Tamiya M60A1 kit, where they actually gave you this bit of detailing, and it's one that you drop directly onto the hull. Although on that kit, it's important to point out that you first need to amputate the molded in lump that's found, and then you can drop the new unit directly in place. Because I have a few of these kits in my collection, I wanted to upgrade all of them with this small bit of detailing because it's an easy way to improve it from the stock kit form. The unit is nicely detailed. It does have its inner handle details that are integrally molded in. And like I said, what I did was I just took the Tamiya one, made a mold of it so I could make enough resin castings to equip all of my vintage Tamiya M60 kits or any other vintage Tamiya M60 kit that comes across my path. From the fire extinguisher now brings us to the driver's hatch. This is the stock unit, and this is one area that was changed on the later redesigns of this kit from Tamiya. If you notice, this hatch here has the profile of an M48 pattern of hatch, where in the center here for the periscope we have this round disc that is integrally molded in. On many M60A1s and vehicles that came after the A1, this design here had a slightly different profile where it looked like a tombstone, and that's where the periscope would then emerge from. Now, this type of pattern of hatch is not inaccurate and is found on this tank family, but this is generally a very early feature for the M60 family. This is found on the original pattern of M60 with the early M48 style of turret. However, I wouldn't be surprised if several of the early A1s utilize this hatch as well, so it's not necessarily an inaccuracy. I also want to point out that when Tamiya re-released their 1970s era of M60 kit back in 2010 or so, that version revised the hatch. Instead of this unit, it's the later pattern with the tombstone molding that I just mentioned. Moving towards the back, nothing really much to talk about. These rear engine deck moldings haven't changed, if at all, from the original tooling kits to the modern renditions of today. The travel lock, I believe, was changed on later kits where they made it a solid piece, but on this kit here, the component is made from two moldings, which is nice because you can actually make the piece fully functional like I did here. So I can have the model in its running format with the gun slung in its travel mode. And this now brings us to the turret. The turret on this model here received the most amount of mods and revisions compared to the remainder of the model. You can see that first and foremost, the turret is completely encased in cast texturing. This greatly improves the look of the model compared to the smooth surfaces which were found on the original kit. It's also a great way to blend and conceal the bodywork required in order to fuse the two halves together. The cast texturing is all-encompassing. It goes from the sides, the bottom, and yes, even the top. And it's one of those features, again, that really pops once the model is fully painted and weathered. Probably the biggest change that I made to the turret, however, involves what I needed to have made to the bottom. Like I mentioned in the other M60A1 video, the bottom portion of the turret here does not have its cutout for the driver's hatch clearance. This was one of the changes that Tamiya would make to their M60 kit in the later re-release version. This feature was added to the stock bottom pan and was blended all in with epoxies and bodywork in order to get it to the way you see it here. This was probably one of the most important mods that I need to make to the model in order to bump up the overall accuracy of this build. And this now brings us to the sides of the turret, and this is where the Edward photo etch set really came in to be very handy. You see, on the original 1970 tooling for this kit, there are no provisions or any other details whatsoever that are supplied to give you the side-mounted tow cables. The Edward set supplies you with all of these details required to outfit this vehicle. Here we have the tow cable eyelet and the other clips that are found on the sides and the rear lower portion here of the bustle. Of course, there's a wraparound set found on the opposite side. Now, on the real vehicle, there would normally be 2 tow cables found in these sections, one for each side. For this model here, you can go the extra mile and add those. However, for this build, I just left it tow cable-less. But it's okay because I still have the tow cable mounts in their proper locations. Along with the tow cable mounts, the rear bustle required some modifications and was helped out by the Edward set. Like was shown in the unboxing portion, the rear bustle rack on the 1970 pattern of kit is very simplistic compared to what is found on the later incarnations of this model. The rack does give you the proper shape for the M60A1, but it is extremely simplistic. This is where the Edward set comes in. The Edward set gives you the photo etch inner basket, which was mounted to this model. The basket mesh did require a bit of hand fitting in order to get it to fit, and this is true for all of these M60s that I've built. For some reason, these aftermarket sets require this type of hand fitting in order just to get the thing to fit correctly. And they know this because they do give you a little bit of extra wiggle room in order for you to trim away to get the mesh where it properly needs to be. When it came time for assembling of the mesh, I actually soldered the 2 mesh halves together because this is the best way to keep them conjoined in a nice strong manner and will avoid a lot of headaches. Namely, if you try to super glue these things together, the super glue tends to not stick right. It'll stick to your finger before it'll stick to the plastic or the metal. It'll pop off. It's easier just to spot solder everything in place. Once the pieces are soldered, then I could go in with the super glue and secure them to the racks. In addition to that, I also added the inner struts, which are absent on this pattern of kit. And these were just fabricated out of thin strips of plastic, or I believe Plastruct may have been used as well. On the outside here, we have this little frame. This frame is present with the Edward set and was just utilized as is. It's a nice simple addition that, again, really helps the Gypsy rack compared to its stock original offering. From the Gypsy rack brings us to the side handles. These are the kit supplied ones and were mounted in the appropriate locations. And no, I did not utilize the kit supplied shiv in order to make these holes. They were done the civilized way with a Dremel bit on a pin vise, and the units were then drilled out, which then allowed the grab handle to drop directly in place. While on this portion here, you can see that I replaced the original kit supply jerry can. The kit supply jerry can, which is seen on the other M60 build that I've done, it's very rudimentary in its overall shape and detailing. Yes, it does give you the basic shape of the jerry can, but it does leave some room for improvement. This one here is a spare unit that I had on hand from the Academy M60A1 dozer blade that I did, because that one has the reactive armor panels fitted. You're going to have some spare jerry cans found on that kit. So rather than having them languish away in my spare parts bin, they were a simple drop-in installation to this build here and really improved the look of the model. Of course, to paint the unit, you want to use a olive green type coloring for the nylon strap, which is typically found on vehicle tie-down straps of this period and, well, even up till today. The bottom portion, of course, would be metal and would be attached to the vehicle, so you want to use the same paint for this portion when you're working on your jerry cans. Moving along to the mantlet and the gun. The mantlet is the stock unit. It was assembled with the stock components, but you'll notice a layer of cast texturing was added to further improve it. What's interesting to point out is that on the 1970 release of the Tamiya M60, it is modeled with the piece being tarpaulin-less. On the later redesigned versions of this kit, this model would be representing the cloth tarpaulin found in this position here, which disables the gun from having any sort of elevation adjustability. If you ever built one of those models, you'll know that the gun just simply gets glued in place and you're basically stuck with how the elevation is represented. On these older kits, however, that's not the case. In fact, for the longest time, if you wanted to model your M60A1 without the tarpaulin, the only option available was to track down one of these older 1970s era kits. In recent years, I believe AFV Club on their M60A1 kit release has the tarpaulin as an option, so you can actually have the model rendered in this type of a format. From the Mandlet, this now brings us to the Xenon Searchlight. Now, the Xenon Searchlight that you see on this model is the kit original unit, but was polished up to the way that you see it here. This is another one of those pieces that is a bit on the dated end, however, can be salvaged into a usable component. Granted, this part is going to be significantly simplistic and simplified compared to the modern renditions that are found on current kits. For instance, compared to the unit found on the Dragon M48 and M series kits, this one here is a grunt compared to the Crescendo found on the Dragon kit. That's just how perfect and wonderfully made those newer units are. But that doesn't really detract from this one. The unit has the overall correct size and shape, and the basic details are there. However, to improve it further, you'll notice that I went ahead and replaced the grab handles that are found on the sides of the Searchlight. The original handles are in roughly the appropriate shape and position where they need to go, but were amputated and replaced with these new handles that I fabricated out of small bits of wire that were bent to shape and then mounted to the unit. This greatly improves the look of this Searchlight compared to the stock original offering. On the front portion here, I fabricated the lens, which is absent on this pattern of kit. The lens is fabricated out of a piece of thin plastic styrene that is actually found on packaging, like blister packs that you always seem to get tons of when you buy stuff online or in stores. Well, that packaging is actually really useful for things like this. I made a template of the lens, and I basically just copied it to the plastic, trimmed it to shape, and mounted it to the unit that we have here. This is another way that greatly improves the overall look of the model. While on the Xenon Searchlight, I want to point out how the components are painted, because of all of the Xenon Searchlights that I've seen in person, as well as the ones on the internet, they all seem to have the same type of format. The rear portion, which is curved in its overall representation, this is the reflective material, and this is best painted in a very shiny chrome type paint. The remainder of the sides of the box, as well as the rear portion here of the bulb, are flat black. Obviously, on the other side of the bulb, this is where the light would be emitted, and this is painted in silver. Now, for the lens, you'll notice a red trim found on the leading edge of this section here, and I believe on the real unit, this is a gasket that seals off the inside of the Searchlight from the elements. All of the Searchlights that I've seen do have that red trim present, and it's a tricky one to add with a paintbrush. It requires a very steady hand, but if you can pull it off, it really helps the look of your model, and it just shows people that you gave that little extra attention to detail to it. On the rear portion of the Searchlight, the mounts are the stock units. They're a bit simplistic, but overall do a good job with keeping the unit propped up and where it needs to be. Another addition that I made was to the power cord. The power cord is absent on this pattern of Tamiya kit, and the power cord that we have here is fabricated out of a thin piece of electrical wire. The wire itself is very flexible and does a great job in staying where it needs to be, but it doesn't inhibit the gun from going up and down with its mantlet. Now, for the power cord, it enters into the vehicle with this blister that we have here. In order to secure it, I just simply drilled into this unit, and that's where the cord, or I should say the wire, plugs directly into. It's an easy addition to make, and once added, really completes the look of the Searchlight on your model. Moving from the Searchlight takes to the barrel. The barrel on this model here is comprised of 3 pieces. A 2-half assembly for the majority of the length, and then a canister for the end tip. Now, just like with all other plastic tank kits on the market, where the 2 halves join, you will have a seam to contend with, and this is part and parcel for just about, again, every other plastic model tank kit that's out there. The seam work removal on this model here was pretty straightforward. I didn't really have any problems with it, which is interesting to point out because on several other very old vintage tank model kits, it's not uncommon to have 1/2 of the barrel slightly fatter or thicker compared to the opposite end, and this requires a little bit more hand fitting and sanding in order to get the piece to look seamless. With this model here, that wasn't really a problem. It was, again, standard for this type of assembly. Now, if anyone's wondering, is there an aftermarket source that you can replace this with? I do know that there are several resin and CNC'd aluminum barrel options that are on the market, but I'm not sure if they're going to be compatible with this tank. Those barrels are nicely detailed, but tend to be designed for the M60A1s with the tarpaulin that are represented. And because of the tarpaulin, you have that little accordion section that's found in this area here. If you try to mount one of those barrels to this model, either the accordion section is going to be found on the CNC or resin casting, which detracts from the look, or you're going to have the barrel be slightly shorter than it needs to be because on those versions, they require you to keep that accordion section and you just lob off the stock barrel and mount on the replacement. Either way, I don't think that's going to be a good option for this kit, so much so that if you're working on one of these models, your best bet's probably just to stick with the stock barrel. From the gun, this now brings us to the remainder of the details found on the tank's turret. The first stop is this guard that we have right here found in this section. This is one of those bits of detailing that are an iconic bit of detailing found on the M60A1. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that this unit here protects the Searchlight from being muzzle swept by the machine gun. The piece is actually hinged and can fold down when not in use. This bit of detailing here is not supplied with the original 1970s kit, which is interesting because it is prominently displayed on the box art. Tamiya would go ahead and tool up this piece for their later redesigned versions of their M60 kits that came out later on. This component here is a resin copy of one of those Tamiya components. Just like with the fire extinguisher handles, I went ahead and made this component so that I can upgrade all of the other vintage Tamiya kits that come along my path. With this component added, you could really see how it fills in this area of the model, completing its look. From the guard, this now brings us to the loader's hatch. This is the stock component, but was upgraded with the Edward photo etch components. The Edward parts is dropped directly on in place and do spice the piece up a little bit. We have the little padlock clamp that we have here and 2 other flange caps that are found on each side. The little handle is added by myself, which is fabricated out of a piece of floor wire. One thing that's nice about the old Tamiya kit is that the hatch is designed out of the box to be fully functional. On the newer release versions, the hatch was more or less a static component, but if you're clever enough and you're handy with a pin vise, you could easily rig the piece to be fully functional as well. Here you can see on the inside portion, the photo etch for the periscope was added, giving you a little bit of extra detailing compared to its stock unit. From the hatch, this now brings us to the antenna bases. Now, the antenna bases on this model are very, very rudimentary in their overall shape and detailing. What's interesting is that the kit gives you the antennas in 2 locations. One here is on the rear, and the other one here is on the front. Now, I have seen a command version of the M60 with a antenna base located in this area here, so it's not inaccurate. However, the antenna equipment that's molded in is extremely dated, like I said before. The kit tries to replicate, I believe, the MP65 antenna base, which, if anyone can recall, is a ceramic type bottom portion that has a rubber middle portion, and then the antenna wire would then plug to it. Rather than keep trying to salvage and keep the kit original ones, I decided it's best to just replace them outright. The one in the front was amputated completely, leaving for the cover cap that we have here, which of course is present on the turret of this vehicle. The one in the back, I went ahead and replaced it with my own resin casting. Now, like the fire extinguisher handles and the guard that I mentioned before, this unit here is a copy from the Tamiya kit that is supplied with the M60A1. The unit was just casted out of resin, dropped directly in place, and it gives you now the missing detail for this section. For the antenna wire itself, I just drilled the piece out with a pin vise and mounted on some floor wire to give you the antenna wire detailing. Needless to say, the addition of the antenna base is another quick, easy way to improve your build. And if anyone is interested, there are a plethora of aftermarket sources out there for antenna bases. From materials in 3D print, to CNC brass, to cast resin, and there's even that one really cool set where the antenna spring itself is an actual real spring, and you can have the piece modeled in a tied down format, which is pretty cool. All these, of course, are at the discretion of the builder. And this now brings us to the tank's mini turret / cupola. This component, again, started off as the kit original and was played with to bring it to the condition that you see it here. Now, this is far from perfect, as the stock kit does have some inaccuracies to it, but it's not too difficult to polish it up into the format here. Note the exterior is covered in its cast texturing. That's one real simple way to improve it. And you'll see that I went ahead and added the little lift hooks that are found in these 3 locations, which are absent on all of the Tamiya tooling, but oddly enough are found on the Academy counterpart. Where the biggest drawback on the stock vintage kit mini cupola is with the hinge work. On the hinge on this stock model, it is rendered in an incorrect format, where we have this type of hinge found on both sides, and the hinge plugs into it in order to facilitate the hatch here to be fully functional. Well, on the last build, I kept it with its stock configuration because that was one of the requirements that the customer actually wanted. He wanted his kit to have as many of the original type features on as possible because it reminds him of the kits that he used to build back in his youth. For my build, however, I wanted to take it to the next step, where I improved it from the kit original. For this model here, I kept the stock hatch. I also kept the stock mini cupola, but what I did was I revised the hatch to have the hinge in its correct location. This unit here is the stock one, and I kept it as is. The other one in this side was amputated and was completely blended away. The center hinge was fabricated out of a strip of plastruct. The middle hinge section was actually originally molded solid to the hatch, of course, but what's nice is that it gives you the indentation of where the hatch hinge needs to go. This is great because then with a needle file, I was just able to delete this section, thus hollowing it out, giving me the open area here to add the hinge. The styrene piece was then shaped, mounted in place, and then for good measure, I drilled out the hinges with a pin vise, allowing me to use a metal pin, securing the piece to the cupola, but allowing it to fully open and close as it did originally. The interior of the hatch is pretty basic in that there's like nothing there, except for this little strut here, which supports the tank commander. If you model one of these and you actually build a little commander figure, he doesn't fall and drop directly into the turret as he's propped up by that little strut that I just mentioned. There is a little bit of diamond plate molded in. Take that for what you will. Now, on the inside here, the little pad is present. I just went ahead and painted it with the khaki and weathered it accordingly. And that's really all there is. The inside of the hatch, again, is very basic. I just wanted to keep it functional because, really, well, why not? Now, on the remainder of the cupola, this portion here, which is a periscope, was originally molded into the unit, but, again, it's very simplistic in its overall shape. The unit that we have here is a replacement, and it's a spare component that I had from one of the Dragon patent family of tanks that I've built in recent years. The unit is molded in clear plastic and is far superior in detailing compared to the original Tamiya one, so it was just a direct replacement. The molded Tamiya one was amputated, and this fellow here was dropped directly in place, and it vastly improves the overall look of the piece compared to the stock counterpart. Moving our way to the machine gun, this is the stock barrel. Only addition that I made was with a pin vise. I carefully, and I can't stress the word carefully enough, drilled out the barrel shroud sections. The vent holes are integrally molded in, but as indentations, which is actually pretty good because it helps align you when you're drilling the piece out with the pin vise. Again, it's one of those procedures where you want to be extremely careful, and honestly, if you don't have the skill or the experience with this type of a detail, it's really best just to leave it stock and just weather it accordingly. Like I said, the indentations are there, so when you dry brush any type of weathering on, it still pops up on the model, and it does have the detailing still present. I also went ahead and drilled out a small little hole on each side here of the pivot point for the trunnion for the machine gun. It's a little bit of improvement, but the real vehicle, if you look at it, has much more sufficient detailing found in this section over here. This is just one half measure, I should say, in order to improve it further. Now, there are several aftermarket replacements out there, and I believe I even have a few of the Academy mini turrets on hand left over from some Israeli Blazers that I've done a number of years ago. However, I can't really use that on this build because those ones are rendered with the tarpaulin in place. And if I have the tarpaulin found on the mini turret and not on the main gun, it's a bit of a chronological problem. So on this model here, I just wanted to have the entire thing without its tarpaulin. So that's why I kept the original cupola for this build. And this now slides us into the paint and the markings. For the model's overall finish, I utilized the exact same finish and weathering that was used on the other vintage Tamiya M60A1 build that I built for private commission. Along with that build, I've also utilized these same techniques on many other 1960s and 1970s era American tanks that are found on the ECA channel. The original color would have been a very dark olive drab, which was found on American vehicles of this period, and then I go ahead and add washes to it to bring it up to the sun-faded look that you see it here. For the vehicle's markings, I went ahead and utilized the kit-supplied water slide decals, and they went on without any problems, which is actually pretty impressive, considering the age of the starter kit as well as the condition that the kit was stored in. This model wasn't exactly kept in super controlled environment, and not just in my possession, but probably in the possession of the person who I acquired this kit from, and God knows how long he's had the model and who he bought it from before him. So the fact that the markings went on without any issues is really a testament to how well the Tamiya markings truly are. In comparison, I've built several other vintage kits, say from Bandai, for instance, or Eshi, and those decals are a nightmare to put onto a model. Tamiya, that's just not the case. They applied on with no problems and lacquered on as easily as something that has been produced, well, say like a year ago. So again, it's a real testament to how well these markings are made. The markings are applied in the locations that were requested by the instructions, and one thing that's kind of interesting and kind of sets off my OCD a little bit is with this portion over here where we have the US Army bumper code. Note how they're really close together on this side, but on the opposite side of the vehicle they are stretched apart. It bugs me a little bit, I'm not going to lie, but the way you see it is how it's represented in the instructions. Also, by the way, with the way the star is positioned right here on the lower corner. It's just one of those little things, you know. The kit does supply you with 2 sets of markings. I went with this version here because, well, it's the one that's on the box art, and it's the one that I always preferred. I always did like the look of the Diamond 12 on the dark olive drab paint scheme, but hopefully I'll be able to get to some of my other vintage M60 kits in my collection and build them as the other version that is supplied on the decal sheet. But of course, more on that is to come in a future video. And that predominantly wraps up the exterior portion of this model. However, the story doesn't end there. You see, just like what was mentioned earlier on in this video and in the last vintage M60 video that I've done, the vehicles were modified from the kit original static format to become motorized. And this build here is no different. To motorize convert this model, I used the same system that I've used on a few other builds that I've showcased on this channel in the past, and that's by utilizing the Tamiya dual motor gearbox. This system has been mentioned several times for really good reasons. The Tamiya system is very affordable, it's easy to put together, it's durable, it's rugged, and most importantly, it is very reliable. The unit itself is very well engineered. I'm going to take the model apart briefly just to show the system installed. Because these Tamiya M60s were originally designed to be motorized, converting one of these models is extremely easy. In fact, this and arguably their M48 patent are probably some of the best and easiest motorized conversions to actually undertake. With the upper hull off, you can see the interior portion of the model. Note, this vehicle does have that little anemic driver's compartment interior platform. This was just assembled out of the box with some basic weathering and just simply mounted for really, more or less why not reasons. Like I said before, the bow hatch is fully functional. So that actually does help when the unit is fully assembled. Now for the gearbox, like I mentioned before, it is the Tamiya dual motor system. And like I've also mentioned in the other videos, this unit here is actually a system that is quite commonly used on several other YouTubers' videos out there where they RC convert small scale models like this one. Because this gearbox here is dual motor system, you can easily hook it up to two small electronic speed controllers, and from there you're basically good to go with your driving system. Now for this model here, I just left it as simple motorized, but again, if you're clever enough and if you want to actually go through the extra hoops and motion, you can actually RC convert this model, and it has been done on more than one occasion by other people. For this build here, it's going to be powered by a AA battery system. Note I have a 9-volt battery jack here in case I actually want to upgrade the model to 9-volt running if the need be arises, but so far the vehicle seems to run very well with a AA system. For the AA's, it uses this little pack over here. The battery holder is one that I get from Radio Shack. Believe it or not, that is actually still a thing for the time being anyhow. These units are nice and highly recommended because of their low profile. You can easily get them to fit into something as confined as this space over here. Like as you can see, it just barely fits in with this front driver compartment. I also want to point out that if you're working on an Academy version and you're motorized converting it, that one doesn't have the little front interior section, so it actually gives you more space on the interior layout. But here's the unit here. For the switch, this model was actually designed to have forward and reverse capabilities by having the motors wired in reverse. Now, what's interesting to point out was that when I first completed the model back a couple months ago at this point, the unit was fully functional, and I was actually zipping around my house with it in both forward and reverse. And then I set the model aside to do other projects, process orders, and film other videos. Well, when I finally got back to the model here to shoot some video with it, apparently the switch looks like it has gotten some corrosion in it, and for some reason I can't get the motors to work in reverse. Now, the motors do work in the forward direction after a little bit of cleaning, I might add, so possibly, once the alcohol gets in there and breaks down some of the corrosion, perhaps the unit will reactivate its reverse capabilities, but for the time being, it's just really going in reverse. Which is unfortunate because I really wanted to get on video the thing going forward and backward. On the bottom here, you can see how I labeled it. Middle is off. Obviously, this arrow is reverse and forward. Now, to flick the switch, you notice it is a low-profile system, so I don't have anything descending from the bottom of the hull. And to turn the model on, well, I'm actually reusing the little shank that is supplied with the kit. So, it beats having it go to waste. With this system, it's really handy because I can just get in here and hit the switch and not cause any sort of problems with the rest of the handling of the model. Here I'm going to go ahead and plug everything back in, get the tank assembled, and while I still have some nice natural sunlight, I'm going to take the model outside and run it through some of its paces. We already know that these things run very well indoors, which is primarily, realistically, the most amount of running I'm going to do with this thing, but it will be nice to see what this thing can do in the lawn. So let me go ahead and get this thing back together, and I'll see you guys again outside. Well, now that we have the tank outside in its natural sunlight, and hopefully the colors look more true to they do in person as they do under the blaring lights that I have in my studio, I'm going to go ahead and turn the tank on, and, well, let's see how she runs. She's tied up. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why for outdoor running, you don't want to go no smaller than 1/16. Let's try this again. Well, as you can see, the model's performance was basically what one would expect for a 1/35th scale motorized model. Like I was alluding to before, this scale is more or less designed for interior use only. Having said that, however, the model performed pretty well, like under the circumstances. The Tamiya gearbox runs in a very efficient manner. You'll notice that the tank ran smooth as well as pretty much quiet. These gearboxes are nicely tuned, and like I said, are a high quality piece. The vehicle does have that nice charming little M60 squeak to it, which again is a nice little added bonus, but that's more or less the rubber track as opposed to the gearbox doing that, but you know, I'll take that regardless. And surprisingly, the vehicle decided to operate in reverse, so I was able to get that on video. The funny thing was, I actually broke one or two small little pieces off in the grass, and while I was recovering them, I hear the tank. It sounds like the tank is running around in the background, and I look behind me, and lo and behold, she was going in reverse. When I went to turn the model off, I threw it in reverse as opposed to off, and I guess the alcohol finally erased any sort, or dissolved the corrosion that was on the contacts, and the model was running backwards as good as it ran forward. So, there you go. Well, I'm going to go and make some quick little repairs, and I'll meet you guys back on the filming table. At the end of the day, this build here filled all of my expectations. Tamiya kits in general are, by and large, always a joy to work on, but these older Tamiya M60A1s were one of the better kits that were released during that generation. Just like I stated in the other vintage M60 video, these kits do have some blemishes on them and out of the box are going to be far from perfect, but do polish into a decent representation of this vehicle. And I guess we now stumbled into skill level and recommendation. Now, all the data points I'm about to mention are virtually identical to the ones that were stated in the last M60A1 build video because, well, it's equally as relevant for this one as it was for the other build. The best way to start this off is stating that if you're the type of individual who is in the market for a 1/35th scale plastic kit of the M60A1 and are looking for something that is extremely detailed, a model that has excellent dimensions and detail fidelity, which is really second to none out of the box, then this is most certainly, definitely, 100% not the kit for you. This model here is a vintage model kit. There's no other way to put it. And several aspects of this particular kit here are representative from the time of its creation. Model kits have definitely improved quite a bit since this particular kit came out. If you're one of those type of people, then this kit here is something to definitely look past. There are lots of other model kits of this vehicle variant in 1/35th scale that would be better suited for that type of an individual. Something from, well, even the redesigned kit from Tamiya, but even that kit's also starting to show its age, as is the Academy M60A1, both fantastic kits. But if you're a real nut for nice detailing out of the box, your best two bets right now is the vehicle from AFV Club, which from what I hear is a fantastic model kit, as well as the new tooling kits that are coming out from, I believe, TACOM. Both of those models would do a far better job with your needs than one of these old fixer-upper kits that I have here. And if you're not one of those type of individuals, perhaps one of these kits here is something to consider and have an open mind about if you encounter one in the wild. These models do build very easily and mostly effortlessly, which again is partially due to the fact of the limited detailing found on the surfaces, but the point of course still stands. If you are a beginner, one of these kits here can easily be tackled, as well as someone who's an intermediate range person. An advanced range builder, obviously you can probably build one of these in his sleep, but generally if you're an individual with that type of skill set, chances are you either already built this kit here or are looking for something that's a little bit more next level, because one of these builds out of the box is going to be fairly boring for you. Now, if the basic model is still even too basic for you, one nice attribute that this kit has is that this is, of course, a Tamiya pattern of M60A1. And because of that, in 1/35th scale, there is a humongous infrastructure of detail components that are designed to upgrade this pattern of kit here. Although, not necessarily this 1970 pattern one, but the Tamiya/Academy M60A1 in general. Just about every single detail, fitting, and aspect of this kit here can be replaced in one way, shape, or form or another with an aftermarket replacement, be it parts made in cast resin or in photo etch. To name a few, you have replacement road wheels from Armor Scale, you have workable track links from AFV Club, cast resin components from Hobby Fan or Def Model, and even dedicated photo etch sets from, again, Def Model or possibly Edward, and in many cases, many of these companies intermix with each other when you're modifying and upgrading one of these M60A1 kits. However, before you run out and start snatching up all the components possible to soup up one of these kits, you do want to keep in mind that there is a slight slippery slope involved with this type of procedure. When it comes to doing one of these older rebuild models, they can be a lot of fun, replacing parts and improving them, but you do have to keep in mind, at the end of the day, is it really worth it? You know, you can dump in probably the cost, if not more, of the base starter kit itself in aftermarket components. And at the end of the day, it's probably not going to be as good as one of the other newer tooling kits that I just mentioned that you can probably get for a lower cost. So this is something that needs to be kept in mind by the builder and really use some discretion on. For this build here, you'll notice I just polished up some of the surface details with the one photo etch set, and it didn't really cost all that much more to the build in order to do so. But again, it's something that you do run the risk when you're playing around with one of these older kits. Now, if you're one of those advanced type of builders, and I know you're out there and you have a ton of spare photo etch from previous builds and you're looking to do something with it, well, you know, maybe grabbing one of these older kits up and just basically dumping it on it could be a fun little project to play around with. Although there are newer kits on the market that have better detailing compared to the stock older kit that we have here, one aspect that this old kit has that is, in my opinion, still relevant in this day and age is the fact that this model here is extremely easy to modify to make it fully functional. Like what was seen in this video, I went ahead and dropped the Tamiya dual motor gearbox into the hull, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. When it comes to motorized converting 1/35 scale models, these Tamiya M60 and, for that matter, M48 pattern kits are probably some of the easiest in the field to make this conversion to. They just beckon to be made motorized. The dual motor gearbox drops right in, and for my build here, of course, I just made it simple motorization, but there are a lot of individuals out there on YouTube, no less, that like to take 1/35 scale models and make them fully radio controlled. If you're one of those type of people, this kit here is extremely recommended. Not only can you make the vehicle RC, which is true for the other renditions of the Tamiya and Academy M60A1 kits as well, but unlike those models, this one here features the gun with the ability to elevate up and down. When Tamiya designed this kit, they omitted the claw tarpaulin, which would be found on the turret as well as on the mantlet. And because of that, this vehicle here has an elevating and depressing main gun. For the longest time, the 1970 pattern of Tamiya M60A1 kit was the only rendition of the M60A1 in 1/35 scale that had this feature. Every other 1/35 scale M60A1 kit had the tarpaulin molded in place, thus giving you the static fixed position elevation gun. This is true for the kits from Eshi, the upgraded variant from Tamiya, as well as the Academy kit. When it comes to making the model fully functional, something like this is a nice advantage to have because you could easily hook this up to a servo or some other type of mechanical system in order to facilitate the gun elevating and depressing. If you're even more clever, you could probably make the gun recoil, but yeah, I'll leave that up to the micro RC experts up on YouTube. Outside of the small scale RC tank enthusiasts, there are a few other people I would recommend this kit to. First and foremost, if you are just getting into plastic models and you're looking for a nice entry-level kit, one of these models here are very forgiving and would be something that you can easily practice your skills on. This kit here is also recommended, believe it or not, for anyone who's a fan of the M60 tank family. If you're the type of person who has just about every single kit out there or rendition of the M60A1, one of these Tamiya kits here is a no-brainer. Although it's, again, more simplistic compared to some of the other builds, it is also one of the first renditions of the M60A1 ever made in 1/35 scale, and by that note alone, it would have a nice spot in your collection. And with this kit here being more representative of a very early pattern of M60A1, this alone should fit into your patent family tree collection fairly easily as well. This kit here is also recommended for anyone who is an avid fan of vintage model kits for reasons that should be all that obvious, but also for people who like to build and collect Tamiya tank models in general. I also recommend this kit for anyone who's recently getting back into plastic modeling after a few decades long hiatus. There are a lot of individuals out there that have built plastic model kits in the past. In fact, wouldn't be surprised if this kit here was one of those models that you built back in your youth, and for one reason or another, you stopped building models or moved on to other things, but are looking to get back into the hobby. One of these kits here is a great way to jump back into it, basically picking up where you left off, dusting off some of those old tricks and techniques and diving right back into it, getting yourself reacclimated. From here, you can easily level up to one of the more advanced or newer kits that have come out in recent years. But this one here, it's a good way to reintroduce yourself to this hobby. Now, I want to briefly touch upon pricing and availability. Obviously, this is a vintage model kit and has been out of production now for a number of decades. For a long time, these kits were quite prolific. Tamiya did make a large number of them, and they were frequently encountered on the secondhand market venues, places like swap meets, flea markets, model shows, as well as, of course, eBay. Within recent years, however, I noticed that the number have dwindled slightly. They do come up fairly often, but are not nearly as prolific as they were even 10 years ago. Prices on them have gone up slightly, but again, are still relatively normal from what I've seen whenever I used to run into these kits in the past. This kit here being the static white MRC box art variant is the less desirable version of this kit that is on the market. Like I stated in the other video, the kit that's in the most demand is the original 1970 release with the beautiful box art, the two-way wire remote, and the two-motor gearbox, which was supplied with the kit. Those models, when found, start anywhere between $250 and go nowhere else but up, depending on the condition of the kit itself. These white box art variants are sold for a fraction of that cost once found. When you encounter one in the wild, expect to pay anywhere between $15 to $50 US, and of course anywhere else in between. Of course, just like with everything, once these models are encountered, they can be found in several different conditions. Anywhere from mint in the box with the shrink wrap to models that are open but not started, models that are partially started, 3/4 of the way built, and fully painted, completed, and, ready for display. Depending on what you're looking for is how you're going to find one and find one that is priced. Obviously, if you're the type of person that are looking to collect the model kit and not touch it, you're going to try to find one that's still wrapped in the original shrink wrap. If you're like me, however, or just looking for a model as a builder, the other versions are probably something that are going to be more to your liking. And because of that, can be found for more affordable prices, coincidentally. I also want to point out that in recent years, Tamiya have re-released this particular kit here, although that one has some slight modifications to it. That's the build that I mentioned in the last model showcase video for this pattern of tank, and on that video you'll see that Tamiya went ahead and supplied this kit with the nice, fancy, beautiful 1970 box art. They also made some other changes to the kit, namely they changed the composition of the rubber tracks to their contemporary material, which is not a bad thing. They changed the detailing found on the bow driver's hatch, and they also went ahead and omitted the shank, which was supplied on these older kits, to add the holes required to fit on the grab handles. Some other mods they made was with the axles for the rear and the front. They made a few tweaks that were different on the older kit, but by and large, the kits are relatively the same. I also want to point out, though, that's as strange as it sounds, but the re-release one found in the wild actually costs more than the original versions that were made during this period. Those kits, those re-releases, retail anywhere between $70 to $100 as opposed to these ones, which are still found for a fraction of that. So more than likely, it's because of the fancy box art. Fancy box arts, man, will get you every single time. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale vintage Tamiya M60A1 main battle tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this fella over here, or the other larger 1/6 scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that are frequently posted on this channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Till next time, see you later. you.